You are listening to All In, a podcast dedicated to helping you fulfill the mission of God in your life and around the world. I'm your host, Jeff Roper. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of All In. What do these people have in common? Tim Cook, Apple CEO, Fannie Flagg, Harper Lee, Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, Hugo Black, Pulitzer Prize winning writer Bragg, Helen Keller, Truman Capote, Hank Aaron, Martin Luther King Jr., Joe Namath, Jesse Owens, Rosa Parks, Condoleeze Rice, Lionel Richie, Hank Williams Jr., Hank Williams Sr., and yours truly. What do we all have in common? Well, we're all from Alabama. I grew up in a small town in the middle of Alabama. It's a town of about 200 people. I fled the state when I was 19 years old and moved as far away from Alabama as I could and still remain in the lower 48. I moved to the Pacific Northwest outside of Seattle. And when I moved, I had such a thick Southern accent. I had to work very hard to get rid of it. I would get up early in the morning and I would read books out loud so I could learn to actually pronounce all the words because my Southern accent was so bad. And to be honest with you, every time I had a conversation with somebody, it would only take about 3 seconds before they made a comment about me being from the South and asked me about, how bigoted I was, how backwards I was, or did I marry my sister? And it was challenging. And, I was on a rare visit to see family down in Alabama, and I was in a large bookstore. Yes, they do have bookstores in Alabama. And it was either a Books A Million or a Barnes and Noble, something like that. And I found this book there called Alabama in the 20th Century. And I grabbed it and I started reading it. And when I finished that book, I thought, boy, this is the way history ought to be written. It was such an engaging and capturing book, the way that it was written, and also scholarly and academic. And when I finished the book, the second thought that I had was that it helped me find beauty in a state that I had often fallen into some of the same judgments about it. It's fundamentalist religion, the redneck culture, the stereotypes, the narrow-minded intolerance, the gratuitous meanness at times that you'd have to deal with. And so I read that book and it really did help bring a better perspective of my home state that I think set me on a trajectory to see the beautiful in the midst of it. And while I was planning this season's episodes of the podcast, I looked over on my bookshelf and there, sitting right in a prominent place where I could keep it, is this volume, Alabama in the 20th Century. And I thought, I'm going to see if I can interview that author because I really like his books. So we reached out to Wayne Flint and asked him if we could interview him. And to my joy and delight, he said yes. So Dr. Wayne Flint, thank you and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm honored to be asked.
Dr. Flint, you have written at least 14 books, and you and I were talking just before the show started. I take it you're on your 15th book right now.
That's correct. I've been working on this one in a sense all my life.
And I tell you, we were talking about it, and I so look forward to it. Two of your books have dealt with Florida politics. 3 of your books have dealt with evangelical religion. 3 have dealt with poverty. You've written 3 books that give a broad survey of Alabama history, including Poor But Proud, Alabama's Poor Whites, and the book I've already referenced, Alabama in the 20th Century. You've also written a book, a memoir, Keeping the Faith, the history of religion and Christian diversity in the 20th century, as well as your most recent book, as I understand it to be, is Mockingbird Songs, Your Friendship with Harper Lee. And you've been nominated for 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and you've won numerous awards. And if I took the time to give all of the awards that this man has won, it would take up the rest of the podcast. I tell you, it is amazing. He has spent more than 40 years teaching, beginning, I believe it was in Samford University there in the Homewood area, and then at Auburn University. We'll forgive him for that. uh, if you're from Alabama, it breaks down to either you're an Alabama football fan or an Auburn football fan. Though I have a real affinity for Auburn. I have a niece who graduated from Auburn University. Dr. Flynn's won 18 teaching awards. He's a social activist. He's been just an incredible influence in the state, in the region, and not only in academics, but in the practical application and living out of the Christian faith. So, again, thank you, Doctor, for being with us. Now, as I understand your story, you were originally going into you went to Samford University to go into the ministry, and somehow you made an alteration and you went into history. Is that correct? And if that's accurate, what caused that to happen?
The Bible.
The Bible took you out of the ministry.
For a two-word answer. Yeah, Jeff, like many young people in the South, I felt called to the ministry when I was barely a teenager. I felt that I wanted to preach. This was certainly not part of my family background. It was just something that happened because of a little church, a Calvary Baptist church in Dothan, Alabama, and a minister who was wonderful and very nurturing to me. Incidentally, John Lewis, the famous civil rights activist and Baptist preacher, was born 9 months ahead of me in 1940. He grew up in Pike County. I was living in the adjacent county, Houston County at the time. And we were both preaching when we were 14. John, in his memoir, talks about preaching to his mother and dad's chickens out in the chicken yard. And my explanation for why John was such a better preacher than I was that he had a chance to practice on chickens, and my family never owned any chickens. So I was preaching at Youth for Christ rallies at 14, 15. He was preaching in Black churches. He graduated high school and went to an African-American Baptist college in Nashville. I graduated the same year and went to a white Baptist college in Birmingham, Alabama. Then we both graduated from college, and he immediately began to engage in the freedom rides and civil rights demonstrations and march on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Meanwhile, at Florida State, I was withdrawing my membership from First Baptist Church in Tallahassee because the congregation voted not to admit African-American students or people to services. I had also begun to help participate in a boycott of the Mecca restaurant next to the FSU campus because they would not allow African-American students at Florida State to eat at the restaurant. I was also going door to door in 1964, campaigning for Lyndon Johnson for president, despite the fact that in 1960, I had become the first Republican in my family and was Alabama chairman of college youth for Nixon Lodge. And that change between 1960 and 1964 came about in basically two ways. One, I've always loved the Bible. I've read the Bible since I was just a young kid. Rather than getting less devoted to it, I have become more devoted to it. I basically begin every day by reading a chapter of the Bible and have now started writing my own concordance of it. And so as I read the Bible, I could simply not rationalize how you could live in Alabama with a kind of racial prejudice and animosity toward African Americans, and came to be Christian. And so every page that I read from 14 on I was slipping the bonds of the culture in which I lived for a fairly radical redefinition of what Christ had commanded of us. And the most notable example of that is the fact that the first and most frequently mentioned theme in the Bible is idolatry.
Hmm.
Do not worship idols, whether those idols are pagan images of some uh, Middle East deity, or whether those deities are materialism, or sex, or fame, or fortune, or whatever. The second most important theme in the Bible is justice and mercy to the poor and to the wretched and to strangers in the land and to the dispossessed. There are more than 2,000 references that I have found in the Bible to the themes of justice and mercy to the poor, to the handicapped, to the stranger, to the abused. And all of a sudden, I'm thinking, the culture from which I come does not reflect the Bible which I read.
Right.
And I thought, how can this be? How can arguably the most religiously identifiable population in America, in the Deep South,
Mm-hmm.
could be the most wickedly anti-Christian in its racism and its injustice? And so I cannot say that there was a teacher that I had in high school or college, or my parents, or my friends, or the culture that caused me to transcend my culture. It was simply reading the Bible. And if people ask me, why do you spend so much time reading and writing about the Bible? Now, I send the 120 members of the Pilgrim Sunday School class a written lesson every week based on the normal Bible lessons we would have if I were standing in front of them. And that one day a week that I spend on nothing but studying commentaries and thinking about a passage of scripture is the most important day of my week.
Hmm. Because still today you teach in a Sunday school there at your home church.
Correct. I
Yeah.
have 120 members, and they are Episcopalian, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Pentecostal, and I have one Jewish member.
Wow. Very
I
ecumenical.
also have African Americans, Nigerians. I've had Ethiopians. It's a wonderfully biracial church. It's a loving church. Uh, it is the single institution that sustains me most fully in my life.
And you find this countercultural, cross-cultural expression of faith still in Alabama.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I might say, Jeff, that that does not mean that everybody in the church agrees with me on anything.
Right. Of course.
We have members who are extremely conservative, members who are extremely liberal. And my point is to affirm them in their biblical and Christian pilgrimage.
Yeah.
It's not to try to convert them to my theology or my racial views or my views of justice. I don't hide those views, but I respect and listen to the views of people different than myself.
Well, that seems to be the key, isn't it? Because we just don't seem to want to listen. We want to be heard, but we don't want to listen as much as we should. And so that's commendable. Remember reading either in Mockingbird, I think it was in Mockingbird Songs, the book you wrote about your friendship with Harper Lee, that book played a pivotal role in turning the trajectory of your life. Would you share that with us? What happened there, and what did that do to your life?
Well, it was, I had actually gotten to know Harper Lee through her sisters. she had two sisters. The older one was Alice, who died at 103. And at 102, she was still as alert as I am, perhaps more so.
Mm.
Louise was the second sister, Alice, the older one. Alice was an attorney. She was a devout Methodist. She was as near a saint as any person I have ever known. She is undoubtedly, during her lifetime, the most respected and admired person in Monroeville, Alabama.
Hmm.
A woman of absolute integrity. I've never known someone about whom I could say, if Alice Lee told me this, I believed it.
Hmm.
She simply never tried to mislead or rationalize anything. And she was the most prominent female lay leader in the South Alabama, West Florida Conference of the Methodist Church. She, like her father, was the primary lay leader in Monroeville Methodist Church. She also was a major factor in the emergence of women within that Methodist conference in leadership positions. And she asked me if I would speak to a Methodist women's conference at the Methodist campground in South Alabama about the Bible and justice. So that's how I got to know her, was the day that my wife and I spent there. Her sister, Louise Connor, was there. And Louise invited us, or she was then a widow, and she invited my wife and I to come down and see her sometime. As you know, that is a typical Southernism, which oftentimes has no meaning whatsoever. So if someone says, why don't you come see me sometime? What you normally do is dismiss this as a Southernism that is required by our sense of courtesy, but has no meaning whatsoever.
Correct, right.
In Louise's case, I asked her, do you really want us to come and see you? Because I am really fascinated by you and your family. But on the other hand, I don't want to come if you don't really want to know who we are. And that is how this all began. We started going down about once a month, and we would take her to lunch to her favorite soul food restaurant in Lumpkin, Georgia, across the Chattahoochee River. And then we would sit on Sunday afternoons in her backyard, and we would just talk about everything, about the Methodist Church, the Baptist Church, Monroeville, Harper Lee. At first, not about Harper Lee, but increasingly frequently about Harper Lee. And then she's the one who actually introduced us to Harper Lee, which was an awkward moment because Harper knew that so many other people were trying to use Harper or Louise or Alice in order to meet Harper.
Right.
And so she pushed back on getting to know us. And that was fine. We loved Alice and Louise. They were both fascinating women. They're every bit as fascinating as Harper Lee and far less eccentric than Harper Lee. And so we really didn't get to know Harper Lee until she had a stroke in 2007. And at first the stroke was hidden from everyone. She was then moved to Lakeshore Rehab in Homewood, Alabama, near the campus where I grew up, went to college. And I was visiting my mother, then a widow, in Birmingham. And we started stopping by to see her because her sister Alice asked us if we would stop by to see her because she was depressed. She didn't want to be back in Alabama. She had been 2 days in her room with a stroke, which is terrible. If you have a stroke, you need to be tended to immediately.
Yeah.
And of course, she didn't have the use of her legs anymore, one side of her body. So at that point, she was needful. And therefore, the handful of people who were allowed in to see her were her lifeline for 6 months in rehab to an outside world. And our task, my wonderful wife and I, our task was to essentially help her not focus on what had happened to her, but focus on other things. And so we took her a CD player and we took her copies of Eudora Welty reading herself Why I Live at the PO. And we took her Jane Austen, turned out to be her favorite writer of all time. And we took her C.S. Lewis because we loved those three writers. And it turned out that those three writers were her favorite three writers. So she was amazed that we had these CDs and a CD player, which we shared with her. And it just so happened these three writers were her favorite writers. So that's the way the friendship began.
And early in your career, if I remember correctly, I read while you were at Florida State, you read her book, To Kill a Mockingbird.
Right.
And that kind of changed the trajectory of your own life. Because as I understand, you had said you would never want to work in Alabama.
That is correct.
And you read this book and something changed there. What was that?
There were two incidents, one horrific, one enormously transformative, which happened literally within months of each other. We had arrived in Tallahassee at Florida State in 1961. My wife was teaching English in public schools. I was doing my doctoral work. And we were at First Baptist Church in Tallahassee. 1963 occurred, and there was the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church and the murder of 4 little girls. We literally came home from the early church service at First Baptist Tallahassee and turned on the TV, and of course all the news was about what had happened at 16th Street Baptist Church. And I remember in tears our vow to never go back to Alabama. We both forswore Alabama. We sat there and said, to have allowed George Wallace to perpetuate a climate of murder and mayhem, and the bombing of 16th Street Baptist was just the worst of the atrocities during a Wallace rally in '63 in Birmingham. 2 Eagle Scouts, both white, both 16, were so worked up by his rhetoric and his demagoguery that they walked out, got in their car. One of them had taken a pistol from his father's house, and they saw a small black kid riding on the handlebars of his older brother's bicycle. And they pulled out the pistol and murdered this 9-year-old boy. And they were both Eagle Scouts and straight A students. Yeah. And all of a sudden we realized the connection between demagogic rhetoric and oratory and bigotry, and the actual consequence of that in terms of the demons and fears and anxieties within people that you allow to come out in the world as a result of what you say and what you do. And so we basically reacted immaturely by saying that is typical of Alabama, and we will never go back to Alabama. And back in those days, with the baby boomers hitting college, if you got a PhD in 1965, your problem was not finding a job. Your problem was deciding which of many job offers you were going to take.
Correct.
And I had an offer in Louisville, Kentucky. I had an offer at Florida State, my alma mater, to stay on there and teach in the history department. I had an offer elsewhere. And then I had an offer from my alma mater. And the first job offer I eliminated was my alma mater
Hmm.
because I said, I'm not going back to Birmingham, Alabama, the very site of this
Right.
mass murder. And then within a month, I finished my coursework. And in the gap between finishing my coursework and starting my doctoral dissertation, I had literally not read any fiction or anything else that didn't pertain to my doctoral field for 3 years. And I told Darty, I'm going to read this book everyone's talking about, To Kill a Mockingbird, which had been published in 1961 or 1960. So I took a week off and I read To Kill a Mockingbird over and over again. And I thought, how could some woman from Monroeville, Alabama, write this book?
Right.
And if there is somebody from Monroeville, Alabama, who can write this book, have I missed something about the state? And literally, that was the transformative moment that brought me back to spend my entire life in this benighted place.
Mm. Because it obviously somehow ignited a love as well, that you were able to see past the Bull Connor, the George Wallace, the all of those. You were able to see past that and find the beauty that was also resident there, and even the, for lack of a better, these prophetic voices that were speaking out of it. Harper Lee, out of the midst. I mean, one of the, the southern part of the state where she was from, that was really the, in so many ways an epicenter. Yet here was this light in the darkness, and it somehow ignited something in you, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, you're right. This is the Black Belt we're talking about.
Right.
This is the place of the very worst racial atrocities in Alabama history. It was a place of slavery, of apartheid, of tenant farming, of lynching. There are at least 4 documented lynchings in Monroe County in the 20th century. So this is exactly what is supposed to be the epitome of this. And yet, Louise Connor was not like that. Alice Connor was not like that. Coley Carter was a segregationist, the father of the 3 sisters.
Mm-hmm.
He was a segregationist. He was a gradualist in terms of his Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
He was willing to see racial change, but gradual racial change. To some degree, that's also Harper Lee's position, as you find out at the end of Watchmen, when she reconciles with her racist father after profanely denouncing him. And so what I would say, rather than love the state, that what I gathered from my experience of reading To Kill a Mockingbird is a more mature understanding of the ambiguity of life. That there are no perfect places. Lord knows Tallahassee, Florida, when we voted 640 to 627 to retain an all-white membership of First Baptist Church of Tallahassee.
Right.
You can say, well, that's a close vote in favor of apartheid.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, good Lord, I thought Tallahassee in Florida was an enlightened place. And you could argue in 2021 that Governor DeSantis is one of the most apartheid-oriented governors in America. And so I think what happened was I grew up, Jeff. I began to understand the Bible and its depiction of the human situation as being the human situation.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes no difference if you live in Sichuan, China, or you live in Auburn, Alabama, or you live in San Francisco, or you live where my son lives in Seattle. The assumption that somehow this is a good place and that is a bad place is incredibly immature.
Exactly.
It's certainly not biblical.
No.
It's certainly not sociological. It is certainly not historical. And so I think what I did as I grew up, and the catalyst for my growing up and my maturation, was a novel, not a
Mhm.
history book. And the savant, the prophet or prophetess, was Harper Lee.
Hmm. Now, after I finished, I've read three of your books, and the most recent one I've read was Mockingbird Songs. And as I was reflecting on it and over the books that I've read of yours, it seems like you are doing in your writing of writing nonfiction, primarily history, you're doing with that very similar to what Harper Lee did with her fiction. Is you are unfolding the human condition in all of its complexity. Now, is that an accurate uh, observation? And if it is accurate, then was that intentional?
That is so accurate that you're virtually the only person I know who understands my career. I don't know how you got that insight, but if I were to say that I started off with that intent, that would be incorrect. I started off simply being an historian. And because I lived in Alabama after my first two books on Florida politics, and in fact, my doctoral field was 20th century American politics. So I began to move away from that first period of my writing and my research into Alabama history simply because I lived here and I understood the state pretty well. But I would say that at first, it didn't dawn on me that something was happening beyond just um, Alabama history. That what I was doing is trying to understand myself, understand my father and mother, understanding my grandfather. I come from sharecroppers.
Mm,
My father was a sharecropper. My father never finished high school.
mm-hmm,
He was probably the brightest person in the family, never finished high school.
mm-hmm,
He could do mathematical computations in his head that I couldn't do with a calculator. He was an extremely gifted man, but he never finished high school because
mm-hmm.
he grew up in the Great Depression.
Right.
Uh, he left the farm in 1937 and spent 9 months in the cold winter standing in front of a steel mill with a sign up, "I need a job."
Hmm.
9 months every day, he would hitchhike to that steel mill. And finally, after 9 months, when they started building the TVA dams, uh, they hired him to work in the steel mill. And so, to some degree, I was trying to understand what life is like from the bottom up. And
Mm-hmm.
luckily, in the 1960s, historians began to write a new social history in which you realized that not just famous people have a history,
Right.
that ordinary people, coal miners, textile workers, sharecroppers, all have a history. They all have a story. And I would argue they tell the story much more interestingly than historians do
Yes.
because it's verbal, it's
Yeah.
oral. My father didn't write down his history. He recorded his history, and I took a tape recorder and I spent hours and then taught courses in American oral history, where
Hmm.
you reconstruct the past through oral inquiry and storytelling. And so, to some degree, I began to focus on the same subject the Bible focused on. That is, if the second most important theme in the Bible is the dispossessed, all of a sudden I became an historian of the dispossessed.
Hmm.
My first book was actually um, the result of another historian who happens to be from the most conservative wing of the Church of Christ, Ed Harrell, who was the first American historian to seriously take interest in Pentecostalism and wrote multiple books on Pentecostalism
Hmm.
and the origins of Pentecostalism. and the Foursquare Gospel Church,
Hmm.
especially in California, and what is now the most rapidly growing wing of Christians,
Mm-hmm.
which is Pentecostal.
Right.
And Ed asked me if I would, he is an extremely suave, sophisticated historian, Vanderbilt PhD. And Ed asked me if I would write a book for a series he was editing at Indiana University on minorities in America. And I said, well, what did you have in mind by minorities? And he said, I have in mind the people you come from, poor whites.
Hmm.
And I said, a book about poor whites. Wow. So my first book in this new uh, arena of history was Dixie's Forgotten People, focusing on Appalachia and people like my father and steel workers and coal miners,
Mm-hmm.
the dispossessed people who have such a terrible grievance against uh, against America because they were left behind by America.
Mm-hmm.
And Jeff, though I did not vote for Donald Trump and deeply oppose Donald Trump and do not find him in any way a Christian, I understand the world of Donald Trump's oratory.
Mm-hmm.
That is the anguish and the sense of being left behind
Yeah.
by all those people in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Ohio and Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana. And I have not been one of them for a long time, but I was born of them.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in their shadow in my family. I have cousins like them who don't understand me, but I try to understand them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there will be no reconciliation in America until those of us who have slipped the bonds of our cultures reconnect with them in a sense of saying, what can I do to heal whatever wound you feel,
Mm-hmm.
whatever wound you have? And I just don't see that happening right now in America.
No. No, it's an unfortunate thing. I read a book recently by author from here on the West Coast, and she had gone. This was published 2016. I forget the name of it, but Angry or Angered was in the title. And she went into Louisiana and studied the people that were the most ardent of the supporters of Trump, and she was just trying to understand them, and did a phenomenal job of coming to understand them and not to demonize them or to do anything like that, but just to come to understand the grievance, the pain, as well as the compassion they had. They had their own ways of sharing and showing compassion with people. So I think it's a critically important thing to be gracious and to listen like you've been advocating. Now, a couple of more questions for you. Before we started the interview, you were telling me about this new project you're working on. Would you mind giving us a little foretaste of that project that you're working on?
No, not at all. It's loosely based. In fact, the idea I acquired from Mitch Albom, who lives in Chicago and wrote a book about a Jewish professor at Columbia University where he matriculated, um, called Tuesdays with Maury. And he had been so influenced by this professor and his wry Jewish sense of humor
Mm-hmm.
and ambiguity and subtleties that he just wrote a book trying to allow you to understand this authentic teacher and how raucously funny and brilliantly insightful he was. And in a quite different way, setting Harper Lee in an historical context of Alabama. So you'll understand who
Right.
she is. But you will also understand that at age 23, she moved away from Alabama in 1949 in New York City, and she never wanted to come back.
Mm-hmm.
She wanted to be buried there. She wanted her ashes. She wanted to be cremated and her ashes dropped from a plane over Manhattan or buried in one of the older cemeteries in Manhattan. And the only reason she ever came back to Alabama in 2007 is because she had a stroke. And then when she left rehab after 6 months, and her sister said, you'll have to come to Monroe for assisted living because you're going to be paralyzed for the rest of your life. And that's a hard life for someone who's 80 years old and living in Manhattan.
Right.
So against her will, she went back to Monroe. And my wife and I, our job was to help her adjust and survive in a place she did not want to be.
Mm-hmm.
In that period, we had 100 visits with the two sisters before we got to know Harper. And 64 visits, afternoons, we spent with Harper Lee. And at first, she was defensive and protective, but over time, we just got to be dear friends, really intimate friends, as the letters in Mockingbird's songs indicate. We were both amazed at her mental acuity despite the stroke. We were both enchanted by her sense of humor. There is an African-American tradition called trading 12s, which comes from musical idiom, jazz, and the way in which one musician will answer the other by doing a riff a little bit better. And then the first one will try to do a little bit better. And this competition of insults or, okay, you did this, let's see if you can do that. That became a fixture in our relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I would insult her, she would insult me. I would insult her, she would insult me. And we would continue this until we were both literally in the floor laughing. And Darty, my wife, who's a very private person and thought this was the silliest thing she'd ever heard of and refused entirely to participate. And Darty would constantly say, Darty, you are married to a nut. And then she transferred that to, Darty, you're married to a maniac. And she would say, and you a Baptist preacher. And so all of a sudden we realized that our job was not to try to make her into us, something she never wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
It was to allow her to be herself, and in every way we could possibly allow her to be herself, to tell her story, however she wanted to tell it. And she told it anecdotally. And as you know from reading To Kill a Mockingbird, and as you will know if you read Watchmen, which is really a profane commentary on race relations in the South. And it's very important to understand the chronology. Watchmen was written when she was in her late 20s, newly arrived in New York, in the context of the murder of Emmett Till, the Montgomery bus boycott, one horrible racial event after another in her home state. And so the first book she writes is a denunciation when she goes home and observes her father, her saintly father, and her fiance, his law partner, at a meeting in the iconic courtroom in Monroe, the scene of the scene of Mockingbird. And she listens in the Negro balcony, the same balcony from which she will later be Scout in Mockingbird.
Right.
But in 1956, 57, when she's writing the book, the first book is Go Set a Watchman. And it is this prophetic book based upon a passage of the Old Testament about justice. And she writes this in this rage she has against Alabama, almost identical to the rage I had in 1963 after the bombing of 68th Street Baptist Church. And so all of a sudden, when I read that book, I thought, this is a Jeremiad, is the Christian.
Mm-hmm.
It's like Jeremiah's prophecies
Right.
of what is going to happen. And so to me, in many ways, you have to understand Watchmen as her first book and the depiction of her father as a deeply flawed man. And the fact that Tay Hawhoff, her editor at Lippincott, read that manuscript and thought, not only is this bad writing, but I'm not sure America's ready for this book. This denunciation of one's ancestors for their bigotry. Maybe America is not ready for this. In 1957, 3 years after Brown v. Board, in the run-up to the Civil Rights Movement, the worst part of the violence in 1960s. And so as I began to read her Watchmen, in some ways, though a horribly flawed book and not well written at all, and without Tay Hawhoff's nurturing of that book into another piece of fiction. That first book is in many ways the most deeply prophetic book about America. If you read Watchmen in 2021, you really think, oh my Lord, she looked into our future and saw who we would become. And then she decides, basically under the nurturing of her editor at Lippincott, that since America is not ready for this book, Hawhoff says, well, there are some vignettes in this book as it was revised that involved children. And so she said, why don't we think about going a different direction here? So instead of an adult Jean Louise Finch, who is at war with her culture, she presents 3 children in that phase of childhood where they are for the first time realizing that the world they're going to live in is flawed. And the adults they love are not perfect.
Interesting. I have 2 more questions for you. Heather Cox Richardson recently wrote a book with a very provocative title, How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. Now, I don't know if you've read that book or not, but just taking that title and assuming that her premise is correct, what lessons from history, specifically Alabama or Southern history, are there particular lessons we can learn from history that can speak to these tumultuous times?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think the answer is, you have to understand I'm a biblicist.
Right.
That is, everything expands into the modern world from the core of the Bible and its understanding. And I think of the passage, there is none righteous, no, not one. And that is such a violation of modern culture, where the assumption is, oh yes, there's plenty of righteousness and I know where it is.
Right.
The righteousness is in, you name the place where the righteousness is. The universities, the Ivy League, the Northeast, the Midwest, you name where the righteousness is. And then we also know where the unrighteousness is. It's in the South. It's George Wallace. It's Donald Trump. And I would just suggest the fact that you can make a really compelling case that the South won the Civil War by leaving a residue that is not so much Southern, which is what the book you mentioned suggests, but is basically biblical. That is, man is born in sin. Man exists in his own ambition and his own ego. We seek nothing so much as our own pleasure and satisfaction. If you want to say that President Trump is the worst narcissist, materialist, and hedonist in the history of American politics, what does it say about Americans that we once elected him president and almost elected him to a second term?
Mm-hmm.
So that narcissism, hedonism, and materialism is not so much something that we can dump on Trump and say, aha, here's our
Right.
problem, Donald
Yeah.
Trump. No, not really. Our problem is that Donald Trump is a mirror to ourselves. And if you want to argue that the South basically converted America by leaving its residue in New York City and San Francisco and Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio, I would say, oh, that's so simplistic. I would say, no, no, no. What you're not looking at is the South. What you're looking at is the racism, classism, sexism, backwardness, bitterness, materialism, hedonism of everybody,
Right.
of every society, every culture, every nation. And the simplest way to deal with that in a way that protects your own identity is to say, oh, that's them. That's
Yeah.
Donald Trump.
Yeah. The scapegoat.
Them in Wisconsin.
Yep.
That's them in Alabama. No, no, no. That's all of us everywhere. And the struggle will always be and is now nothing more than struggling against who we were born as and what we can become if we have a transformative experience in our life.
Yeah, that is so good. That is so good, because we do fall into that trap, don't we, of passing the blame. We scapegoat. We always ascribe to other people. Everybody's worried about cancel culture. I'm much more worried about other cultures. Oh, they're othering people, where we say, oh, they're the ones that are wrong. It's those other people, not us.
And Jeff, in Watchmen, one of the brilliant things about it is after this book long, I mean, literally the whole book is a profane, obscene denunciation of her father and her fiance.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the book, basically what the father says is, you just need to go back to New York because you don't belong here. You're not of us. You don't have to live in this culture and make sense out of it and negotiate all the ways in which, if you don't want to be bombed, you don't want to be killed, you don't want to be ostracized, you don't want to lose all of your friends, you have to live inside this culture. And basically, she then becomes an accommodationist. That is Jean Louise. She says, I can't live here, but I understand what you're saying. And there is, to use C.S. Lewis's wonderful paradigm, in the beginning, there's innocence. Then there is sin, mistakes, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. And then there is punishment and alienation and bitterness and division. Then there is an attempt to understand who we are, and that understanding results in the good times, in the best times, in the hopeful times. It results in forgiveness and reconciliation. That's the biblical trajectory of life. And I would add that if America has any future, it will be the American trajectory. And that we will learn not only to judge each other, but that we all are flawed and that we all have to learn to forgive each other. And it is only as we understand our flawedness and forgiveness that we will ever have reconciliation and unity. And those words are political cliches, and we've forgotten the rootedness of those cliches in a way of life and in a biblical sense of justice that is really our only hope.
Right.
Because I don't think we have a lot of hope in the Democratic and Republican parties.
Correct.
We find our hope someplace else.
So true. One more question. I ask this of all of our guests that come on the show. If we had a time machine, we could go back to your 25-year-old self, what advice would you give yourself?
Well, I would just point out that I was happily born in 1940 and thus came of age in the 1950s. Leave it to Beaver, all in the family, before the sexual revolution of the 1960s and the birth control pill and all the rest, the women's movement and so forth. It was such a halcyon age. I was so wonderfully blessed with my parents. Their protectiveness of me, their kindness toward me. I grew up in a world so protected from a lot of problems in a period of prosperity. Wonderful teachers, wonderful public schools. And, I could wish for everybody the world I had, but I know that's history cannot be put in reverse.
Right.
We can't drive backward in time. And so I guess what I would hope is that we can have the biblical pattern of trying to forgive and understand each other rather than to constantly denounce each other. That the end of our story is the end of Harper Lee's Watchman book. So deeply biblical and so deeply rooted in the idea that we can fight so hard for the causes in which we believe that we break all of the relationships that are really important to us. And that gradualism may not be the worst thing in the world. Mm-hmm. That gradualism is not a rejection of a righteous world. Rather, it is a strategy of achieving a righteous world without the fracturing of every single relationship we have.
Yeah. Well, Doctor, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. It has been a joyful, delightful conversation. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. I've enjoyed it very much.
Hey, before we go, I want to remind you that you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Also, I'd like to encourage you to share this episode on social media or through email. Get your friends and family involved if you think it'll help them. And finally, if you benefit from this podcast and or you believe in our ministry of making disciples of nations by developing healthy Foursquare church planting movements, would you consider partnering with us in prayer and even financial support? Go to my website, jeffroper.com, and you'll see the link there that says support our work. We would appreciate it. It helps make this ministry possible. God bless you guys. It's your life. Now go live it.